Today I'm going to talk to you about energy flow in ecosystems, specifically producers, consumers, and the feeding relationships between producers and consumers, how that relationship is then expressed in different types of ecological pyramids. So let's start with producers, because producers are the beginning of any food web. They are what support any ecosystem. Sunlight is the main source of energy for all life on Earth. Organisms, they capture energy either from the sunlight or from other chemicals, and they use that energy in order to create their own food. Any organism that can create its own food is what is known as an autotroph. So you and I are not autotrophs. We can't produce our own food. We have to consume other organisms in order to obtain the energy that we need to survive. Another name for autotrophs that can produce their own food is producers. So autotrophs are producers in an ecosystem, in a food web. Producers come in different forms. Plants use photosynthesis, as you know, to produce food from the energy that they capture from the sun. So incoming solar radiation in the form of electromagnetic waves is captured by plants, and in the presence in combination with carbon dioxide and water, plants are able to chemically convert those molecules into glucose and oxygen. So on land, the best autotrophs are plants, the organisms that are able to most effectively create their own food are plants. In water, the best autotrophs are algae. And then in tidal flats and salt marshes are cyanobacteria, which are basically bacteria that can create their own food. And also, if you remember from last semester, cyanobacteria were the very first living organisms on the planet. They first evolved about 3.5 billion years ago. So these are three different types of producers living in three different types of ecosystems. Some autotrophs can actually produce their own food without sunlight. Absolutely amazing. This process is what we know as chemiosynthesis. It's the process where organisms are using chemical energy in order to produce carbohydrates. Typically, it's glucose as their energy source. It's performed by several different types of bacteria. There are bacteria that live deep at the bottom of the ocean on these vents, these hot water vents that are the steam is being produced by the hot magma that's underneath the surface of the earth. They can also be found in hot springs. When you look at hot springs, like the one of the most famous are the hot springs in Yosemite. The different colors that you see in those geysers are actually bacteria. And then also in tidal marshes. All right, let's talk about consumers. Many organisms, animals, fungi, and many bacteria can only acquire energy from other organisms. So any bacteria that cannot make their own food are not autotrophs. And if you're not an autotroph, you're a heterotroph. To be a heterotroph means that you have to consume another organism in order to obtain the energy you need. So all humans are heterotrophs. Even if you're a vegetarian, even if you're a vegan, you're still a heterotroph, because fruits and vegetables were once producers. They are another living organism. The only way to not be a heterotroph is to make your own food, and the human body is not set up to photosynthesize. Heterotrophs are also known as consumers. These are the different types of consumers. You can be an herbivore, which means that you eat only plants, carnivore, which means that you eat only animals. Omnivores eat both. The human body, our digestive system, has evolved to be an omnivore. Now, there are some humans that choose to be herbivores. There are even a few humans that choose to be carnivores. But our bodies did evolve to be omnivores, so mammals are technically classified as being omnivores. There are also dirtivores, which feed on plant or animal remains and other dead matter. And then there's also decomposers, which help to break down organic matter. Now, the organisms, detrivores and decomposers, it can be confusing as to what is the difference between these two. In fact, sometimes those two terms are used interchangeably, but there is a slight subtle difference between them. Detrivores do feed on decomposing matter and feces, as do decomposers. However, decomposers are not able to digest big lumps of matter as detrivores are. So think of earthworms. Earthworms feed on soil. Decomposers such as bacteria and fungi do not feed on big lumps of matter. They're actually breaking matter down at the molecular level. Let me talk to you more about feeding relationships. Energy flows through an ecosystem in one direction. It always starts with the sun, and it starts with the sun or inorganic compounds if the organism is chemiosynthesizing. And it moves from the sun to the producers, from the producers to the consumers. So sunlight or inorganic compounds to autotrophs to heterotrophs. That is the only way that energy flows through an ecosystem. This feeding relationship is often shown in food chains. A food chain is a series of steps in which organisms are transferring energy by eating and being eaten. So in these examples, we start with the producer, which is the plant on the left side. We move to the primary consumers, the secondary consumers, the tertiary consumers, and then the top consumers. So the energy is being transferred from one organism to the next as each organism is being consumed. However, food chains aren't a realistic portrayal of how energy moves through an ecosystem because ecosystems are simply too complex to be represented in a food chain. Organisms are opportunist. Their intent is to survive long enough in order to be able to reproduce multiple times. In order to do that, they are going to utilize any food source that is available in their surrounding ecosystem. If an organism is reliant upon one type of food, they could be in danger if that one type of food were to be exterminated. So imagine you ate nothing but peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Well, what if there was a peanut shortage and peanut butter wasn't being made anymore? Well, you wouldn't have enough food source and you would eventually die out. In order to show a more realistic portrayal of how energy flows through ecosystems, what's more often used are food webs. Food webs represent the complex feeding relationships in ecosystems. Food webs are composed of a whole bunch of different food chains that are linked together. So what a food web is showing is all the different possible food sources for an organism in its ecosystem. And what you end up seeing is in the food web, there are individual food chains, but often 2 or 3 or 4 or even more food chains share organisms. In a food web, there are 3 trophic levels. Each step in the food chain or the food web. So producers always make up the first level because energy from the sun or inorganic compounds passes directly to the producers, and then consumers make up the second, third, or higher levels in the food web. Let me talk to you about how we represent energy that is moving through moving through an ecosystem. So food chains and food webs are showing what organisms eat other organisms in order to obtain energy. These ecological pyramids are showing the amount of energy or matter in an ecosystem. So ecological pyramid is a diagram that shows the relative amounts of energy or matter contained within each trophic level of a food chain or a food web. What that's also telling us is how much energy is available for the next trophic level. There are 3 types of ecological pyramids. There's energy pyramids, biomass pyramids, and then also pyramids of numbers. And let me talk to you about all 3 of those. Energy pyramids are showing, as the name implies, the energy that is flowing through an ecosystem. So it's showing how much energy is available for the next trophic level. Theoretically, there is no limit on the number of trophic levels within an ecosystem. However, remember the 10% rule? Only 10% of energy is actually available for the next level, because 90% of the energy that is obtained by an organism through consuming is used by that organism for its own bodily processes, or it's lost as heat. So the more levels that there are in an energy pyramid, the less energy is available. So essentially, ecological pyramids show decreasing amounts of energy, living tissue, or number of organisms at each successive feeding level, at each successive trophic level. The pyramid is divided into sections that represent each trophic level. Because each trophic level harvests only about 1/10 of the energy from the level below, because only about 10% of the energy is available to the level above, it can support only about 1/10 of the amount of living tissue. This is why it's a pyramid, because there's less and less energy available as you move through the trophic levels. The other type of pyramid is a biomass pyramid. This is showing the total amount of living tissue in a given trophic area. So basically what a biomass is showing is how many grams of organic matter are available per unit of area. So how much grass is available per unit of area, how many trees, how many flowers, etc. So it's showing the potential food that is available at each trophic level. And again, this becomes less and less as you move up, because there's less energy that is flowing through each trophic level. It takes a lot of grass to be able to support an entire ecosystem. And finally, there's the pyramid of numbers. The pyramid of numbers is showing how many individual organisms are actually available at each trophic level. What's interesting about the pyramid of numbers is the typical pyramid structure actually begins to break down, and it may not always look like a traditional pyramid. For instance, in forest, there are actually by number fewer producers than there are consumers, because one tree can support a lot of life. So the pyramid of numbers may look like a traditional pyramid. As you see at the top, this pyramid of numbers here, you can see there are a lot of producers, and the organisms are becoming fewer and fewer as you move up the trophic level. However, they can also look like this. So these more accurately represent a forest where there are actually by number, not by biomass and not by the amount of energy available, but by actual number, there are fewer producers, because trees are so large that they can support a number of consumers.